About in the 60s, actually, let me back up. I have two children. I have a son and I have a daughter, and I had prodigal son and daughter. And when my son was a prodigal, he went big time. He got married at a young age and went through all the counseling at the church, and he was doing really good, and they said he's ready, he's okay, he's grounded in the Word, and he has a good foundation, and so we'll go ahead and marry him. And he got married, and then he got involved in alcohol, and he got involved in drugs, and he became a drug dealer, and he was way off, ready to fall off. He got divorced from that wife, and then he came home to live with us when he was 25 years old. It's not easy having your son move back home with you when he's 25 years old. So here he came into the house. He had one side of his head was shaved. The other side was long past his shoulders, and it was dyed green. And then on his ears, all the way up, maybe 5 different places, he had pierced his ears all the way up and had earrings hanging from his ears down there. And I prayed diligently, as every mom does, Lord, bring this prodigal back to you. Because he would be so angry towards the Lord, not wanting having anything to do with the Lord, that we would say grace at the table before every meal, and he would be so angry that his hands would go into fists like this, so that when he opened them, you could see the prints on his hands. But I prayed diligently. And one Sunday, he actually said, Mom, he said, I think I'll go to church with you. So trying to be very cool about this, I said, oh, that sounds really good. He says, when we were walking in, it was just he and I, and his dad was teaching and preaching that morning, and he said, do you think that they will accept me? And I said, oh, sure, no big deal. But we're talking about a time when it was a big deal to look like that in our church. But I think he was testing all of us, because he looked his worst that day. And he walked in, and thankfully, nobody looked or batted an eye at him. They just treated him just like any other person in the church. And I'm so thankful, because as we look at this aspect of being partial towards others, someone could have been partial towards him, but because such love was shown to him, it helped to bring him back into a right relationship with the Lord. And I can say today that my prodigal is on the other side now, faithfully, lovingly serving the Lord. Now, the book of James is a very practical book for us, and it shows us the signs of one who's truly experiencing and exhibiting believing faith. We're told that true faith is revealed by how we walk as well as how we talk. It's one thing to talk my beliefs, but it's another thing to walk them every single day. And the dominant theme that we've had throughout this book, and we will continue on as we finish it, is that true faith is a faith that works. In other words, it's a do this book and don't do that book. C.J. Goodspeed, or Godspeed, said the book of James is just a handful of pearls dropped one by one into the hearer's ears, having many divisions. And chapter 1 gives us just a few of these pearls, reminding us to be doers of the word and not hearers only. And let me say, pearls are always appropriate for every woman, even if you're wearing jeans. But this book reminds us to be joyful and to continue to trust God even through trials and temptations. So many of you are going through trials and temptations. All we have to do is click on Facebook and we see our Simply Needed column or the prayer area for Reliance Church, and our hearts break daily with the needs and the hurts and the wounds that people are experiencing. But as we go, and that first chapter, lastly, we were reminded to keep ourselves unspoiled or unspotted from the world. We did not deal with that specifically very strongly last week. But I want to say that as Christian women, our walk should match our talk, and we should keep ourselves unspotted from the world. Several years ago, I was invited to a friend's wedding, and as I walked into the vestibule, I heard her voice calling me from the side room, the bride's room. And she said, come in here with me. And she had some other girls in there, and she was looking beautiful, as every bride does. I've never seen an ugly bride. And she had this beautiful, beautiful gown on. But while she was in there, she had a bottle of nail polish, and she pulled that out, and she was doing some touch-up on her nails. And she dropped the nail brush, and it bounced all the way down the front of her beautiful white gown. There was no way at that point to get that gown cleansed. So we all got straight pins, and we made an inverted pleat on the front of her beautiful bride's dress. Now, I don't know if she ever got that nail polish out. But sometimes, ladies, we brush up against the world, and we get the filth from the world, and we need to be careful to keep our garments spotless and clean, to avoid these things that are spots on our garments of righteousness. Now, as we look at chapter 2, let's read this together, just a few verses. It says, my brethren, or my sisters, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For there should come into your assembly a man or a woman with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a man or a poor man or a poor woman in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing these clothes and say to her, you sit here in a good place, or say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit at my footstool. Haven't you shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? And then he goes on to say that this ought not to be. In 1739, the Church of England had become so prejudiced and inhospitable to the common man that John Wesley was compelled to go into the graveyards and the fields to preach the gospel, because there was no place for the dirty, coal-covered miners in the established churches. Isn't that a sad commentary on the church of that day? And he said in this article that at one time he actually preached to 30,000 coal miners out in the fields and out in the graveyards, because these people were not allowed into the sanctuaries. James was concerned about the prejudice that had already raised its ugly head in the early church, and he's literally saying, if we looked at the Greek, he said in verse 1, do not receive the face, referring to someone who is looking at the externals rather than the internals. And being a respecter of persons is a sign of being a carnal Christian rather than having true spirituality. And ladies, let me say that there are two kinds of Christians. Two kinds of Christians, even in our church. You can be a carnal Christian, be born again, but not walking in the power of the Holy Spirit. Or you can be a spirit-filled Christian. There's no in between. Although I find myself in the morning going from spiritual to carnal as the afternoon goes on. But basically, my desire is that I would be a spirit-filled Christian. And so being a respecter of persons is not being a spirit-filled Christian. Proverbs 28:21 says to show partiality is not good. Leviticus 19:15 says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality. My goodness, how we're seeing that in our world today, aren't we? We need a revival. James teaches us this principle by giving this example of a rich man and a poor man. The rich man is described as wearing fine clothing, all decked out with gold rings, flaunting his wealth, his prosperity, and his status, and having at the root of all of this a heart of pride. Scholars point out that in Rome during that time there were shops where clothing and jewelry and all of these finery things were actually rented out. So wherever they could go, they were looking like they were wealthy and prosperous. And it was all just a show. Shows you what kind of hypocritical attitudes we can have. The poor man, however, came in wearing filthy garments, possibly from his occupation. Maybe he was a shepherd. And shepherds were the most lowly on the totem pole. They were the ones who were smelly, they were dirty, nobody wanted to be around them. They were like someone who would be a blacksmith or a coal miner. And many believed that this was happening in the church at that time, actually, and it can even happen in our own churches today. I remember when we were pastoring in Poway, in the San Diego area, we had a woman come in who was a bag lady. And she was dirty, she was critical of everything, and she would come every time the last amen was said in the church, she would make a beeline for me. And she would sit there and she would tell me all of her problems and how bad person was to her and how bad that person was to her. And all I wanted to do was get away from this woman. She was consuming me, draining me of everything. And I was starting now to look out of the corner of my eye. When I could see this woman coming down the aisle towards me, I would get up and go the other side. And finally, as I was praying one day, the Lord said to me, look, she's been to every single church in this community, and you are the last church listed. And if you don't love her and show her impartiality, you will not be loving her in the way that I love her. Because you see, I died for her. And she deserves someone to love her. So the next time I saw this woman walking down the aisle, I got up and I went to her. I threw my arms around her and I just hugged her and told her how much I loved her, because God had filled my heart then with love. And I said, let me pray for you. And do you know what happened? The very next Sunday and the Sunday after that and the Sunday after that and on down the line, she never came back. I think God sent her into our church and into my life to show me what it meant to have a loving heart. And God looks at our heart rather than the outward appearance. He reminds us of this when we look back in the Old Testament and we see that David was chosen over his brothers. Remember, Samuel brought all of these people in front of David, all these men, these brothers. But David was out in the field, lowly shepherd. And he said, that's the one I've chosen. I remember back in the 70s when the Jesus People movement was going on and all the world was in a turmoil because of the Vietnam conflict, and the hippies were rising up at that time, and everybody looked different and strange. The girls would come to church with no bras on, and everybody was barefoot, and the men wore long beards and had long hair down to here. If you've ever seen Greg Laurie in those days, Greg Laurie had hair down to here. Now he has no hair. But these people were people that were valuable to the Lord, but the churches, the traditional churches, had rejected them. Today, it would probably be those who are pierced and tatted and have man buns. I don't know. Maybe it would be a bag lady who would wander onto the property, somebody that's homeless or helpless. And Ellie, I read this morning on Facebook that they have a problem now with leprosy breaking out. How many of us would want someone like that around us? But if we're truly loving the Lord, there'll be no room in our heart or our actions for prejudice, partiality, or judging. Paul reminded us in Philippians chapter 2 that we're to have the mind of Christ towards others, esteeming them better than ourselves. Jesus came as a lowly babe. He came to lowly parents, and he came to lowly shepherds, and then he sacrificed himself for lowly mankind. He reached out to the unlovely lepers, the hated tax collectors, the sinful woman at the well, the demon-possessed. He loved on these people, and they were the lowest of the low. He stooped to wash the disciples' feet. He stripped himself of all his garments, and then he sacrificed himself to take our place. The rude of prideful partiality is in thinking that the person who has prominence, power, or possessions can do something for me. The root of all of this is self. What can that person do for me? Just being next to him, can I look important too? Can I glean something from them? Now, Peter's a good example of one who was judging. God gave him a vision, remember? And he let down this sheet, and he showed him all of these things that were unclean. And God said, get up and eat. Peter said, not me, Lord. I won't ever have anything to do with that. I'm totally kosher. But now, God said, get up and eat. And he was showing that now there was no barrier between Jew and Gentile, and there's no distinction between them. There's no distinction between the rich or the poor, between male or female, between circumcised or uncircumcised, between black or white. And this is the hard one that I struggle with, between Democrats or Republicans, between liberals or conservatives. I have to pray about this continually, because my prayer is usually something like David's, Lord, break their teeth. I want to be loving because they deserve my love and the love of the Lord. If God so loved the world, are we not called to do the same? That means the world. To show partiality is to place ourselves in a greater position than God himself. That's pretty heavy, isn't it? Just think about that. Partiality is a sign of carnality, and it's the evidence of one who's weak in faith, immature in faith, and has an unmerciful heart. Partiality is based on superficial values. James is not saying that it's wrong to be wealthy or to have riches, but he's talking about those who are trusting in those rather than trusting in the Lord. And that's why he said the poor are rich in faith, because they have no resources to turn to, so they turn to the Lord. But listen, I know wealthy people who are very, very spirit-filled and are very generous with their wealth, but I also know poor people who are critical and angry and bitter. So it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with how we're treating one another continually. And the key to overcoming a judgmental attitude is found in verses 8 and 13 of this chapter. We are to fulfill the royal law of love and to let mercy rule. That's not always easy, because sometimes we think judgment is deserved and the consequences of someone's actions. But sometimes, most of the time, the Lord said, let us have a merciful heart and an understanding heart. I remember when my son was living at home during those prodigal years, and he would get paid on Friday. He managed to hold down a job, and he would get his paycheck, and then he would be gone for the weekend, and I would not hear one word. We did not know where he was. We didn't know if he was in a ditch with his head blown off. We didn't know if he was out in the street, if he was in jail, if he was in a hospital. It was the worst time of my life as a mother. And I can remember crying out to the Lord so many times, Lord, where is he? What's he doing? My daughter would call all the hospitals to see if her brother was there. And we laid down certain rules in our home, that if he was going to live there, that he had to abide by our rules, or he would be out. And one weekend, he was completely gone, didn't tell us where he was at. He knew the rule. And we went on to church. And can you imagine how hard it is for a pastor to stand up and give a message twice on a Sunday morning when he doesn't know where his son is, if he's dead or alive, and the grieving and the pain that goes on? And we went home, and our son had dragged himself home finally, putting us through this agony. And he was up in his bedroom with the door closed, sobbing his eyes out because he knew he had broken the rule and that he deserved to be out on the street again because he had been out in the street before. The Lord spoke to us so strongly, and he said, this is the time for mercy, not judgment. He deserves to be out there, but mercy triumphs over judgment. My husband wrote him a letter, and he said, God has extended mercy and grace to us, and we're going to do that for you today. And he slipped it under my son's door, and I could hear my son in there sobbing his sobs and cries. And God used that grace and mercy to pull him back to where he's walking with Jesus today. And he says today it was that note and the grace and the mercy that brought him back. He says we're to fulfill the royal law of love, loving God as God loves us. This love that God has for us is unconditional. Aren't you thankful for that? It's not based on my performance. This love that he has for me is undeserved. I deserve death. It's unhindered. Nothing can thwart it. It's unending. It's eternal. He loved me before I was even formed, and he will love me through eternity. This love is unsearchable. I can't figure it out. It's uncompromising. When I need discipline, he disciplines and corrects me. This love for me is unchanging. It will never change. God changes not. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. This love for me is unselfish. He has only my good in mind. It is unbiased. It is unconstrained. And it is unexplainable. This is agape love. There are 4 different words in the Greek for love. The highest of all is agape love, those words that I've just described to you. The first one is agape, the second one is phileo. That is brotherly love, where we get the city of Philadelphia from. Another one, the third one, is storge. This is family love. I love my children. I love my husband. I love my dogs. And the fourth one is eros. And actually in the Greek it is not mentioned in the Bible, but it is implied all the way through. All of these loves are good. They're all created and ordained by God. But agape love is the highest of all. And let me say this and make it clear. Only a believer in Jesus Christ can give agape love to someone else, because it's God's love in my life, and my life, his life, extended towards others. That's why, just a sideline here, that we're not to be unequally yoked with a non-believer, because one can extend agape love and the other can only extend phileo, storge, or eros love. This kind of love is only possible for others when we understand how wretched we really are and how great he is. We've kind of come through a movement, and I think we're still involved in it, where we're all trying to find our identity. You know, the problem is that we need to forget about our identity and focus on God's identity. Our response then, as we begin to see who he is that we begin to love others, and our works prove our faith in him. Remembering who we really are, sinners who are saved by grace, keeps us in that state of humility, as well as remembering that we will be judged with the same measure that we judge others. That's a little frightening to me, because I tend to judge others. I'll be honest with you, I have a problem with that. I always have an opinion about everything. It's not always wisdom, it's not always from the Lord, but I have an opinion. Just ask me. In verses 14 to 26, this is another one of those pearls, this section. James tells us that faith without works is dead faith. He's not saying that the works of the law will save anyone. However, he is saying that true faith is evidenced by our works. Remember, this is a very practical book about working out our faith in God. We are to work out what he has worked in. It's not an exchange of faith for works, works for faith, but they are to go hand in hand. And James gives us those examples of Abraham and Rahab, who obeyed God's command. Real faith obeys the leading of God in complete obedience to his commands. To obey whatever he says is our work. My work might be different from your work. And sometimes we get works mixed up with doing things. But our works are just simply to be obedient to the Lord. If you're a mom here today with little ones, your work is to take care of those little ones and raise them, disciple them, discipline them, train them to know Jesus Christ so that they will be responsible adults and know the Lord and serve him. How do you know, moms, if you're not raising the next Billy Graham or Charles Spurgeon or Amy Carmichael? How do you know those things? You pour into them what God's poured into you. You have a work to do, and that work is simply being obedient to that heavenly calling. There may seem a contradiction between the teachings of Paul, who tells us that salvation is by faith alone, but James tells us that faith without works is dead. Paul dwells on the source of our faith, and James tells us the fruit of our faith. So one is the source of our faith, and the next one is the fruit of having that faith. Paul's teaching focuses on the time before our conversion, and James focuses on the after of our conversion. Doesn't that make it easy to understand? Kent Hughes, an author, points out that James' point here is that there is a belief which is not true faith, and he gives the example of demons who believe but not have saving faith. And he also points out that there's not a demon in the universe that's an atheist. But even though they believe God is the Son of the living God, their belief is not founded in saving faith. John tells us in 6:29, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. The unregenerate heart puts works first. My works, my keeping the law, my baptism, my church membership, all of these things will win our salvation. Jesus said, the first work is to believe, to put our trust in him. Let me close with this. Religion says do, and Christianity says done. Now do.